Hey guys, so in today's video, I wanted to talk about the one thing that I feel is the most essential for understanding religion. You really kind of understand all religions. They all start to make a lot more sense once you understand this one key concept. Stay tuned. So oftentimes on this channel, I really, stress the importance of dreams when we look at religions and we look at spirituality. It doesn't matter where you go in the world, it doesn't matter what society you observe, everywhere on planet Earth where there is a human civilization, they have at one time or another looked to dreams and altered states of consciousness as meaningful sources of information. This is actually the oldest expression of human culture that we can find. If you look at cave art from 200,000 years ago, it's clear that the people at that time were entering altered states of consciousness in order to have visionary experiences, to reach out and contact entities within the spirit world. But one of the major problems with this is that dreams do not operate according to the same kind of logic that governs our waking experience. One of the big criticisms I have of my own faith, the Roman Catholic Church, is the importance of Aristotelian philosophy and the influence of scholasticism on our theological thought. And this has had an enormous influence on Western civilization. One of the things that always kind of amuses me is that when people will approach religion, they'll sort of critique it, or they'll question it on the basis of whether or not it makes sense. They'll say, well, that does make sense, or that doesn't make sense. And they really think logically about everything that's going on. In fact, it's become a kind of a trope or a cliche in our culture to say, faith and reason must be reconciled. But I stand on the other side. I say no, faith and reason cannot be reconciled because God is ultimately transcendent to anything we can think of. And religious experiences, when you look at them, are not logical in nature. You can find these profound testimonials of people who have entered, altered states of consciousness or near-death experiences, and they describe things which blatantly don't make sense. One of my favorite examples of this, comes from Buddhism, right? And in Buddhism, I learned as a practicing Vajrayana Buddhist that the world is fundamentally like a dream. And as we near enlightenment, that dream-like nature of reality begins to emerge in our waking experience. And I recently found an article that was talking about this, and it was talking about the importance of visualization within meditation. And it talks about how, when we visualize different things in our minds, it brings us in some sense into a kind of altered state. It brings us into an interior dream-like reality. And when you look at the testimonials of yogis and mystics within the Eastern traditions, as well as those within the West, you find these unusual stories. For instance, one story that's mentioned in this particular article talks about a yogi who was climbing through the mountains of Tibet with one of his disciples. And the disciple said that he saw a seashell on the side of the road. And the yogi stood up and stood in the seashell. But the seashell didn't get bigger, and the yogi didn't get any smaller. Now, if you stop and think about that, it's logically inconsistent. How can a human being stand upright inside of a seashell on the side of the road without the shell getting bigger or the yogi getting smaller? And it's interesting how the Buddhists have really stressed these things, right? They've stressed and maintained tradition around these inexplicable experiences, these experiences which simply don't make sense. And you find similar testimonials today, people describing experiences of God that simply defy reason.
And as I had the knowing I needed to look down, appear in front of me a pair of eyeglasses. And I've never worn glasses before, and God said to put them on, and I didn't know how I was going to put these glasses on, because I have to understand these glasses weren't normal pair of glasses that you would find here on Earth. These were the size of a vehicle, and I'm thinking to myself, how am I going to put these glasses on? I just don't even know. And I remember as soon as I had the thought of how am I going to do this, it didn't even matter. My hands were already drawing the glasses near to put them on my face, and by the time that I got them to my face, it wasn't even a problem. They fit perfectly, and I could really see. And then God said, now look.
So he motioned to me, and we took a few steps, and all of a sudden we were at the end of the horizon. That doesn't make any sense, but we came across to what looked like the end of the horizon. You couldn't go any further, and I couldn't understand what it was. And yet I could look out, and I could see all this vast fields and mountains. And then that creature stuck its hand in this horizon, and he ripped it open like a veil, and he stepped out of it.
And so, you look at it, you look at religious tradition, and you say, well, if this is where religion comes from, it comes from dreams and altered states of consciousness, then is our reason and is our logic really sufficient for grasping this reality? One of the things we always do in debates in the West is we argue the logic of our religious beliefs. We argue quotations of the Bible. And it's interesting how in the West we've become increasingly conscious of the fact that this is all superfluous, that it really doesn't matter. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why I think a lot of people in the Western world today are looking to Eastern traditions.
Welcome. We are gathered here today because we are spiritual, but not like religious,
I don't believe in organized religion. Except for Eastern religion, which I am interested in. It's just like deeper.
Eastern traditions, especially that of Hinduism, is filled with a profound amount of diversity. You have Shaivite Hindus, Smartist Hindus, Vaishnavite Hindus. You have all these different religious sects, all these different gurus, and yet the religious people of India relatively live at peace. And that's because the Indians have long understood that multiple different forms, multiple different symbols can express the truths that we find within religion. The spirit world is not obliged to conform itself to a particular set of ideas or a particular logical form. One of the things I find really interesting is I was just reading the Navajo myths, and it talks about how in the beginning, when the world was made, everything was a void and everything was in darkness, and there were 4 clouds that arose: a black cloud, a white cloud, a yellow cloud, and a blue cloud. And it says that from these clouds came the first 4 beings, 2 coyotes and the first man and the first woman. And it talks about how these beings were not beings the way we would think of them. They didn't have any physical form. They were more like a misty reality. In fact, the Navajo referred to them as the misty people, right? And you say, why the misty people, right? And why clouds? And why all of these subtle things? That's because spiritual phenomena are subtle phenomena. They change, they bend, they meld. This is why heaven was always projected up into the sky, right? We said that, God is in heaven. God is above our heads, among the clouds, right? But we've sent planes up there. Hell, I've flown in a 747. You look out the window, there's no, city built on the clouds up there, right? It's the idea that spiritual phenomena are subtle phenomena. They're like the air. In fact, that's where the word spirit comes from, is wind or breath, right? These are subtle phenomena. And so when we come away from our religions with these rigid ideas and these strict lines of Aristotelian theology, of saying, well, that's logically inconsistent to see God in this way, it's incredibly foolish. Because ultimately, when you have an experience of God, it transcends anything the mind can conceive of, so that contradictory ideas exist happily in the spirit world. It reminds me, in fact, of a story I recently read about Our Lady of Medjugorje, where Mirana, in her first vision, she was wearing a watch, and after the vision was done, she said that the watch had completely flipped over the y-axis. Everything on the watch was backwards, and even the mechanics inside of the watch had been flipped around. And this is a perfect expression of how in the unconscious mind, time is malleable. And this, I really think, is what many traditions talk about when they talk about the end of time, the apocalypse, right? Coming into the spirit world. This is something that Roman Catholics fortunately recognized, right? Some point in their tradition where death itself is in some sense the end of the world, right? Where we're coming into a breakaway from this notion of time. I was just listening to an interview between Joe Rogan and Brian Greene, and he talks about this, how asking questions like what happened before the Big Bang could be logically inconsistent themselves, right? The idea of time is something which is strictly appropriate to our physical waking experience. But when you slip into the spirit world, this all comes loose. This all starts to be undermined.
The thing that snapped me into realizing I was dreaming was it's my digital clock. I couldn't really read it. It's like the circuitry was all screwed up or something.
Yeah, that's real common. And small printed material is pretty tough too. Very unstable. Another good tip-off is trying to adjust light levels. You can't really do that. If you see a light switch nearby, turn it on and off and see if it works. That's one of the few things you can't do in a lucid dream. What the hell, I can fly around, have an interesting conversation with Albert Schweitzer. I can explore all these new dimensions of reality. And not to mention, I can have any kind of sex I want, which is way cool. So I can't adjust light levels, so what?
But that's like one of the things that you do to test if you're dreaming or not, right?
Experiences questioning their understanding of the nature of reality. Because if you wake up from a dream and you realize this is the real world, and then you wake up from this world into what seems to be an even realer world, philosophically, you have a genuine problem there. For people who haven't had these experiences, it's very tempting to, when they feel very grounded in this world, to say, well, it's nonsense, you took a drug. If you entertain for a second that anything else is happening other than that you've taken a drug and you're hallucinating, then you've gone insane.
And so when people start to talk about the spirit world, the question that really we have to pose is what provides the spirit world then with any notion of structure? All right, because if the spirit world is so subtle and if the spirit world is so malleable, then what's to say it even exists at all? Or what's to say it isn't just a figment of the imagination, something that we can manipulate simply with our will, right? Could that be the afterlife, that you just live in a kind of dream-like scenario? But what's interesting is that, dreams are not entirely up to us, right? We often say, dreams are imaginary, but, most of us can recollect at least one time in our lives of having a dream that surprised us, a dream we didn't expect. And that's because there are intelligences within dreams, right? One of the interesting things is people will talk about in lucid dreaming, right? They'll say, well, when you lucid dream, the other characters in the dream often don't like it when you wake up in the dream. It's as if they have their own agenda that they're trying to follow through with, right? They seem to have an autonomy, an intelligence of their own, so that there are forces, powers, deities within this spirit world that transcends our physical reality. So then the real question becomes, what provides the architecture, the scaffolding, what provides order or a sense of predictability to the spirit world? And the message here is that it's energies, it's powers, it's instinctual currents of force, you might say. This is really one of the profound insights that have come out of perennialism, right? And this is pioneered by first Adolf Bastian, and then Carl Gustav Jung, and Joseph Campbell, and now even today Jordan Peterson. Many of these thinkers talk about the archetypes of the collective unconscious. And where these insights came from was when anthropologists and psychologists looked at different religions from all around the world. They recognized that, albeit on the surface these religions differed greatly, underneath the surface and below the phenomenology of that culture form, they found that there were tremendous consistencies and reoccurring themes that would crop up everywhere. And so what was recognized by the psychologists and by the anthropologists and comparative religious studies professors is that basically what we have here are energies. These are currents, these are forms, these are forces that infuse the unconscious mind.
So this is the mysterious sorcerer of Les Trois Frères. Does he represent a deity or does he represent a shaman? There's been an argument on this, and it doesn't make any difference whatsoever, because the shaman in that form would be the deity. So we keep thinking of deity as a kind of fact somewhere, God as a fact. God is simply our own notion of something that is symbolic of transcendence and mystery. The mystery is what's important, and that could be incarnate in a man, in an animal, not incarnate, but recognized in a man or in an animal.
One way that I heard it described, and I think this was in The Origins and History of Consciousness, is to think of the archetypes as the picture forms of our instincts. That the unconscious mind is infused with these powers, these forces. And as Joseph Campbell beautifully put it, he said, religion is the language of the self-archetype, the nucleus of the unconscious mind communicating with the ego system. So this is really difficult to understand, but what you essentially have to do in order to understand religion is to recognize that the organizing force of the spirit world is not material phenomena or physical forms or causality or, stuff, so to speak. There are no rocks in the spirit world that are solid the way we think of that, right? Instead, when you're dealing with religion and you're dealing with spirituality, you have to think of energy. You have to think of intuitive, emotional, psychological energy that manifests itself in a particular form. So that each religion becomes a kind of tapestry, a language, right? And the energy or the communication is intuitive. There has to be an intuitive communication going on. And the forms, the symbols, and the concepts of religion are quite secondary. They ultimately must serve that intuitive and instinctual form. So that's to say that religion itself becomes a kind of language. It becomes a means of translating the messages of the unconscious mind as it's communicating with the ego system. So that really, when you look at different religions from all around the world, you say, well, why are there so many religions? Why do there have to be so many different traditions? And why do they contradict one another? It's not really that the religions or that religious truth contradicts itself. It's that the language or the forms contradict other forms. But you can find this even within the same religion, right? There are contradictions or seeming contradictions that religions have to wrestle with. And this is something I've talked about in my book, The Way of the Dream, right? Where, the Buddhists really understood this, and they would always emphasize to their pupils, do not fixate on the concepts and the ideas, because if you do, you'll get lost in them. Ultimately, you have to look through that concept to the transcendent or the intuitive reality which lies beyond. And this is really where you can discern genuine religion and genuine spirituality from facade religion and facade spirituality. Because facade religion that's just superficial and all from the head, is dry, it's dead, it carries no psychological potency, it's just words and concepts and ideas. And we see a tremendous amount of that in Christianity today. And this is why many people are leaving Christianity to head over to the East.
We've come to the point of reading back along the missions of the Son and the Spirit, to read those as marking eternal distinctions in God. That is to say that the missions reveal processions. Once you're theologizing about that and thinking about those processions, the question does come up, okay, there's one God, and because of the missions we have reason to think of distinctions within the one God, but God's not made of parts, so they can't be distinctions of parts, and there's several other things.
Everything should be asleep, but you must be awake. Your body should sleep, your mind should sleep, everything should sleep, but you must be awake.
When you fast asleep, you are in perfect tune with the existence, one with the existence, isn't it? Nature has given you this. If you've forgotten, every day when you go to sleep, it makes you one with the existence. In the same sense of unity, if you can wake up and walk around, you made it, isn't it? Every day, you have free enlightenment when you go to sleep. But the problem is you're unconscious.
It's just like deeper.
Right? Ultimately, the efficacy, the efficiency of a religion to communicate with the ego has to function as a translator, as a medium through which instinctual and transcendent powers can connect with the ego, so that when you hear a deep and profound religious story, it connects with you, it resonates with you, and you understand it, and you go, I get it. But it's not a getting from up here as much as it's a getting from in here. It's an understanding from intuition, right? And this is why we have so many different religions is because each culture, each society, and each community has over time cultivated their own way of understanding these symbols and metaphors. And each religion has to be taken as a whole. This is one of the reasons why I don't encourage something called syncretism. Syncretism is this process of just taking all kinds of different religions and throwing them all together. It's essential to understand that as a religion forms over time, it doesn't just form, like science, right? We think in terms of science today, right? You can't just develop a religion by thinking about it and saying, okay, this is what makes sense to me, so we're going to put it together like that, right? That's not how religions work. Religions ultimately have to be constructed with the cooperation of the unconscious mind. They have to be sculpted, shaped, and revealed by the power and the transcendent wisdom of God. So the religions must evolve organically. They must evolve intuitively. You can't invent a religion of your own. You can't just study a bunch of religions and put them all together and think that's going to work. It won't, because ultimately you're inventing a language all your own, but that language was not invented by the unconscious. It was not invented by the self-archetype. It was not invented and formed by a revelation from God. One of the metaphors I like to use to point this out is, you may have two puzzles, right? So imagine you have a photograph of something, a mountain scene, right? And you want to make two puzzles of this thing. And in one puzzle, you make the pieces very large, and in the other puzzle, you make them very small. And now these photographs could be of the exact same thing. You could be looking at the exact same scenario, right? But you can't take a puzzle piece from the one puzzle and put it into the other. Because the way that it's been conceptualized, the way that it's been carved out, right, is completely different. So the essential thing here is that religions function in the same way, that you cannot switch and move and equate a bunch of different things. All you can really equate between different religions are those fundamental archetypes of the collective unconscious. And some people are tempted to just function on that level, to say, well, I don't need a religion, I'll just function with the archetypes. But the problem is that you don't have a way of engaging with the archetypes, right? You need religion to bridge that gap where the archetypes mean something for you and that they form a tapestry. They all come together and they form a picture that is unique, right? That allows you to really penetrate into the depths of the unconscious mind. Another metaphor that I like to use is to think of the spirit world in terms of a wilderness. If you've ever listened to people who've done psychedelics, you can appreciate that the spirit world is profoundly diverse. There's really no limit on the possibilities that can exist out there. I often like to compare the spirit world to the galaxy, to the cosmos. You look through a telescope, you look at the stars thrown out there across the galaxy, right? Who could imagine all of the different worlds, all of the different possible realities which exist up there simultaneously? Well, what most mystics will tell you is that the space between your ears is even greater, right? And the idea that we can treat religion as a map of the spirit world, and that's what most people try to do. They get a hold of their religion and they're like, here's my map of the spirit world, right? But then they have an experience which is way outside that map, right? And I think oftentimes that, God will do this to people quite intentionally to show them that our little egocentric, mental picture of the spirit world is so small in comparison to that profound reality. The spirit world is just beyond anything that we can imagine, and things which seem contradictory and nonsensical can occur there, no problem at all. So that the ego is completely incapable of owning or possessing or surveying this thing with this mental picture, with this mental, habit, this Aristotelian logic, so to speak, right? It's completely incapable of doing that. And it must rely instead on an intuitive comprehension of those spiritual realities. This reminds me of one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, the discernment of spirits, being able to intuit and being able to feel your way through a spiritual reality. So that ultimately the best way to think of religion is to think of it as a path through the jungle, right? If the spirit world is this vast and unfathomable wilderness of phenomena and spirits and entities and God knows what else, right? When you choose a religion, you're really choosing a road. And I don't really like to use this metaphor of saying all roads lead to Rome. You know, the New Age kind of hippie spiritual movements would like us to think that, oh, you know, you can just do whatever you want and, you know, you just feel your way to God, right? And you'll just get there no problem at all. You see, they want to avoid the rigidity. But what that rigidity really provides is structure, right? It provides predictability. And it's ironic in some sense that this rigidity is not a self-evident reality within the spirit world. You know, if you look at it, I mean, the beautiful imagery that we find in many different mythologies and religions, right, is the chaotic waters which existed at the beginning of creation, right? These are really the chaotic waters out of which emerged the world, right? In the beginning, in Genesis chapter 1, God speaks into the chaos of the waters and out comes the world. Brahman, you know, emerges out of an egg, out of the chaotic oceans at the beginning of the world. Amun upon the, you know, Mount Benben in the primordial waters of Nun comes up and speaks the Aeneid gods of the Egyptian pantheon into being, right? These are all different images which express the fact that the spirit world is chaos. The spirit world, you know, is just unbelievable chaos. And in some sense, you know, a religion is like choosing a bridge which God has created, choosing a road that can traverse over the void of space and time, right? It's very, you know, I can't help but kind of go into myself and think of this image, you know, like a bridge of light, right? Where the bridge is subtle, but it supports you by the will of God. And this is what it means to choose a religion. You're choosing a destination. In fact, one of my favorite verses in the Hindu Bhagavad Gita is from Krishna, where he says, you know, whatever deity a man worships in his life, that's where he'll go in death, you know. So if you were a devotee of this God or of that God, then that's where you're going to arrive at the moment of death, right? So that our worship, right, is in some sense a choosing of a destination. You know, you could think of it even in terms of space itself, right? You think of different celestial realms, you know, different heavenly realms, the New Jerusalem, you know, or maybe the Vishnu heaven, you know, Vaikuntha, right, where Vishnu reigns over his kingdom, right? If those are planets, then in some sense by choosing a religion, you're choosing a destination. You're choosing where you want to go when you die. So that there has to be at least some sense of rigidity, and not because the spirit world has to be that way, but rather because that's what we have to rely on. We have to hold on to something. And the concepts, the ideas, the images, the metaphors, the ceremonies that we perform in a given faith tradition serve as that road. They serve as that bridge upon which we can walk. So, you know, when people come to me and they say, well, which religion should I choose, right? It's an incredibly difficult thing to say. I mean, I don't really think that anyone chooses a religion. In some sense, the religion has to choose you. You've really got to find a faith practice that connects, that resonates, that calls to you, right? And if you haven't found that calling, if you haven't found that experience which resonates, then you've really got to reach out to God. You've got to say, you know, God, connect with me, come into my life. I'm asking you to come into my life. I'm asking you to speak to me, to reveal yourself to me, to guide me and lead me. And I'm quite confident He will, right? God is doesn't hesitate to connect with our lives and to lead us and to guide us to that meaningful experience of being one. So, you know, a lot of people are confused when they come to my channel because they think that, you know, they see some of my videos and I appreciate all these diverse faiths. I appreciate all these different diverse religions. And they think that I'm teaching syncretism or New Age spirituality, right? Where all roads lead to Rome. When in reality, what I'm teaching is something more along the lines of, there are many roads, only a few lead to Mount Everest, and none of them are easy. You know, that's really, you know, there are many spiritual roads. I mean, hell, you can worship Pan, you can worship, you know, Artemis, you could worship Thoth, the god of wisdom. I mean, but that doesn't mean any of those worshiping, you know, or any of those traditions are going to lead you to that experience of God, right? There are only a few select paths that really strive for the transcendent, and all of them are difficult. All of them require discipline. All of them are strict and rigid in their sensibility, right? So that, you know, it's fine to appreciate all different kinds of religions and to study different things and to be spiritual, you know, and say, oh, I love this and I love that, right? But you're not really climbing the mountain. You're just sort of surveying all the trails and wandering around the base of the mountain, right? This is syncretism, right? People who are syncretists, they just gather up different concepts, ideas, symbols, metaphors. They try to glue them all together. Never works, never does anything, right? Ultimately, we have to connect with God as individuals. We have to connect with that divine, transcendent mystery source. And then we have to recognize it through the symbols and metaphors of our particular faith. So you can see how, religion is the narrow road. It is the narrow way. There are so many tripfalls and so many things that we can fall into. But the key point, the key message is to always remember that religious truth has to bring us a deeper sense of peace, a deeper sense of compassion and love, and that fear and paranoia and arrogance and pride and egoism and all these toxic emotions are not the marks of authentic spirituality. As Jesus famously said, you can tell them by their fruits. And as always, thanks for watching.